It is so wonderful to see so many of you here, and I'm here with, as well as the people that you're going to hear tonight, our Victorian Senator Janet Rice, and all the way from Western Australia, our Senator and my co-deputy leader Rachel Seward as well, all out to share in what I think is going to be a wonderful evening of vision and inspiration. We're going to have a wonderful welcome to country from Auntie Georgina Nicholson from the Wurundjeri, and she's unable to make it at short notice and sends her apologies. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here in the audience tonight, and also note how great it is to be part of a party that has elected, in a state that has elected the first Aboriginal woman to the lower house, to the House of Government, and who Lydia Thorpe, who is kicking goals and who is hopefully not only going to help Victoria become the first state where we might negotiate a treaty with our first owners, but actually potentially make it treaties, recognising the real system of governance that was in place before white arrival. And it makes my heart swell with pride to know that we're potentially only months away from that, thanks in large part to Lydia and all the people working hard in our Greens team in State Parliament. Now, you've been given a job already and you've done it extremely well. You've been asked to text us the issues that you care about and that matter to you. And you've told us you care about climate change, refugees, rising inequality, something's close to my heart, getting rid of Peter Dutton, and politicians serving their own interests. And in my case, the last two coincide, but we'll put that to one side for the moment. What we're here to do tonight is to talk not only about those issues, but all of the other issues that don't get an airing at a time that they should. And many of you will have watched on with dismay over the last few weeks, months, years at what's happening in our political system. At the same time as a 12-year-old girl attempts reportedly to set herself on fire in Nauru, our government decides to have a debate amongst itself about just exactly how racist they want to be and how they can be even harsher towards refugees and people coming here seeking our help. At the same time as parts of the Arctic are on fire, we have an active discussion in our government about pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And at the same time as Australia is on fire during winter, our government talks about how they can put more money into new coal-fired power stations. And what is incredibly lacking, and notably lacking, is any discussion about vision. And tonight you're going to get that. You're going to get vision in spades, and you're going to get vision in spades from some very eminent and thoughtful people who, and at the end of it, we're going to have a chance to have a discussion with them as they'll all join us up here on the panel. And I hope that this is one of those occasions where you walk away from it feeling like we've really turned a corner and we've had a discussion about the things that we need to be having discussions about. And to get us underway, there's someone who I'm not going to give you a lot of introduction and information about, because she's going to tell you all a bit more about herself later on. But to kickstart the evening, please put your hands together for Emily Wuramara, who is going to give us, I was privileged to listen to it during the rehearsal and hear parts of what she's got to share with you. An amazing performance, an amazing sharing of her story with you. Please put your hands together for Emily.
Hello everyone. This song I'm going to sing for you is called Lady Blue, and it's a song that I wrote for my grandmother, and it's something that she used to call the sea in Anatolioga, which is my mother tongue. Tentaraka Makarda. Lady Blue, feel the waves in my head, so calm and cool. Perfect, no despair. I wish I could swim here forever, Miss Lady Blue. Me and you. Run down the way that we go. Pulling up, picking up the sand in our toes. Past down the whistling trees. Lady Blue, she is calling me. Blue. Oh, Miss Lady Blue. Nana, he says, don't ever be afraid of her. Her soul is pure, clearer than a crystal in the moon. And I believe that she told the truth, 'cause ever since my heart is in the sea. Run down the way that we go. Pulling up, picking up the sand in our toes. Past down the whistling trees. Lady Blue, she is calling me. Blue. Oh, Miss Lady Blue. Lady Blue. Oh, Miss Lady Blue. Run down the way that we go. Pulling up and picking up the sand in our toes. Past down the whistling trees. Lady Blue, she is calling me. Oh, Miss Lady Blue. Oh, Miss Lady Blue. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. More, that was fantastic. Thank you. Now, we've got an incredibly high calibre of speakers for you lined up tonight. One of the problems about having an incredibly high calibre of speakers who are very important people and very capable and able to do amazing things is that they sometimes get asked at the last minute to go and do some of those amazing things. And so it's with apologies that we pass on that Gillian Triggs hasn't been able to make it tonight because of something that she'll explain to you herself.
Well, I'm Gillian Triggs, and I'm very sorry that I can't be here with you this evening for this, I think, very important discussion that you're about to have. I have recently been appointed by the United Nations to head an independent panel into abuse of office and harassment within UNAIDS and looking at other agencies as well. So I think and I hope it's useful work. So please accept my apologies for this evening. But I did want to be part of tonight to say that I also have a vision for Australia, and that is an open, welcoming, multicultural society according to the rule of law within our democracy. What I mean by that, and mean by stressing that, is that these have been very divisive and unstable times, and I think we now have to think about how we can draw Australia together around values that we all agree with. And I think we've perhaps not understood the extent to which the last few years have seen an unprecedented rise of government discretion, of ministerial powers, particularly the Minister for Home Affairs. I think it's time now that we looked at a Charter of Rights for Australia. We're the only democracy in the world that doesn't have one. And I think one thing our democracy lacks is some benchmark statements of what we believe in. The rule of law, equality before the law, non-discrimination, recognition of our Indigenous peoples, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, at least a voice to Parliament, but these could be included in some form of Charter of Rights for the Federal Parliament. We would then have a benchmark to consider what our democracy means, what we mean in terms of our vision for the future. So good luck with these discussions this evening, and I hope very much to hear what you've all been talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. Someone who we do have with us tonight is someone who's been an inspiration to me and I think to many of you in the room as well. Tim Flannery is, I think, clearly Australia's best known environmentalist and conservationist. And one of the things that I was most pleased about was when we had that wonderful period where the Greens were in balance of power in federal parliament in both houses back in 2010. We were able to get some real action on climate change. One of the things that we got was, and helped establish, was a very, very important institution that would conduct the important role of going out and talking to the public and educating the public about the science of climate change. And I think as you fast forward a few years now, you understand the significance of having an educated and literate public. Sadly, that Climate Commission was one of the first things to go under Tony Abbott. But undeterred, Tim and the rest of the crew got together and crowdfunded for the Climate Council, which has continued to go on strong and is continuing to speak truth to power and saying what needs to be said about how quickly and urgently we need to act to make sure that we stop runaway global warming. So please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Tim Flannery.
Well, thanks. Oh, I hope that's okay. Good. Thanks so much, Adam, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here this evening. And could I thank each and every one of you for being here this evening. Events like this are incredibly important and vital to our democracy. It's very humbling to follow Gillian Triggs. She's my great hero in many ways. I tried to work out recently whether she or I had got more negative reviews in the Australian newspaper. I think we probably run a pretty close race. But anyway, what she's doing and what she's saying is hugely important. What I really wanted to do this evening is to try to point a way forward to outline the next steps that I think we need to take if we're to really make a big difference in terms of combating climate change here in Australia. I know that the battle can feel like it's endless. It feels like we have one step forward and then two back. And at a political level, it's been a bit like that. We haven't been able to have consistent policy, haven't been able to have a persistent federal voice. But just look back 5 years and see what we've achieved as a people, as humanity. 5 years ago, there was no Paris Agreement. We've had the very first agreement on climate change, which you saw industry get behind. You saw many political leaders get behind. True, the Americans have tried to leave, but the fact of the matter is that they won't be able to leave until the day after the next president is installed, following the next presidential elections in the USA. Venezuela isn't in there, but apart from that, the world is all together on this. And that's a huge achievement we should never underestimate. 5 years ago, wind and solar power required subsidies from government to be cost competitive. Today, they are the most cost competitive form of electricity generation across the board. So people who say coal is cheaper are totally out of date. Wind and solar are cheaper, and that's why for the last, 15 years in Australia or more, it's wind and solar that have been built because it's the cheapest and continues to be. Batteries. I remember 5 years ago thinking, gee, I'd like to have a battery on my home for my solar panels, looking at the cost and sort of curling up my toes. That's no longer the case. Batteries now are becoming an integral part of our electricity system. And you've only got to look at the great Tesla battery in South Australia to see what's happening there. I mean, that battery paid its way in a matter of weeks, I think. It's just so superior in terms of its performance, in terms of helping to stabilise our grid. So we have come a long way. And of course, electric vehicles, 5 years ago, it seemed, where would you think about a charging point for an electric vehicle? How much would you have to pay for a Tesla? How many months would you have to wait for it? Those things are all changing now. So we're moving into a new world. If we can just get 1 or 2 electoral cycles with some stable policy to support clean energy and support the transition, I am totally confident that we will have won the battle. And the reason I say that is that today it's cost competitive for wind and solar to run against, say, building a new coal-fired power plant. But 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, we don't know exactly when, sometime in that time frame, it's going to be cheaper to build and run renewable energy than it is just to run old coal-fired power plants. That's because the cost of maintaining them keeps going up and the cost of building new clean energy infrastructure keeps going down. So if we can just get through the next couple of cycles, we will have won that battle. Now that doesn't mean that we will have won the climate battle, yeah? Because we have come to this issue very late. If we'd acted after Rio, the Rio Earth Summit in '92, it would have been so easy. If we'd won at Copenhagen and been able to act, it still would have been fairly easy. But we are late coming to things. And what that means is that there's enough greenhouse gas in the atmosphere now on the balance of probabilities to carry us through the 2-degree barrier of warming. And scientists are increasingly saying what we need now is to get some of the gas out of the air. The way I think about it is, we've had an economy for the last 150 years that's been based on breathing out, expelling or emitting greenhouse gases. That's how we've run our economy. We now need to turn that around and for the next century have an economy that draws the gases back in. And of course we can do that. And I just want to run through a few of the possible ways that we can do that. One of them is through the hydrogen economy. We take wind energy and the overnight wind that's not wanted, and we make things that we currently make out of fossil fuels, so we start to offset those emissions. We can make fertilisers today, nitrogenous fertilisers today from our excess overnight wind power in South Australia cost competitively with using gas in this country, natural gas to do that. CSIRO published a report on it last week. You can see how important that sort of stuff is. We can actually shandy hydrogen into our gas pipelines and compete directly. So using that wind energy that no one wants overnight at the moment, make something that's going to compete with the gas sector. Less fracking or no fracking. We can take them head on with this if we look at innovation, look at the things we need to do and move forward in those economic areas. So hydrogen economy, hugely important. And it also, of course, is a great way of storing energy. Cheap batteries in a way. When it comes to our built environment, you can already buy carbon neutral concretes in Australia. Concrete is hugely emitting. 8% of global emissions are due to concretes and cements. We can already buy concretes that don't emit anything in Australia. They're about 3% more expensive than traditional concretes. So if we had a carbon price in that sector that was just 4%, we'd already be shifting the balance to having these clean materials replacing pretty quickly the dirty production methods we currently have. If we look offshore, the potential for seaweed, growing seaweed in this country and globally is huge. And if you look at our Pacific neighbours, it's enormous potential for them. So grow seaweed, sequester the carbon, it goes to the bottom of the ocean, and develop ocean permaculture, where we grow the protein we'll need for an expanding population through this century in clean, sustainable ways. If we start investing now in those approaches, we can achieve so much. Carbon fibre technology. Just down the road here in Geelong, we've got some of the world leaders in carbon fibre technology. There's people now who are experimenting with using CO2 from the atmosphere to make that carbon fibre. If we can do that, we can take the problem and turn it into the solution. We need a goal to energise all of this. To me, the obvious goal is let's aim for taking 18 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year out of the atmosphere by 2050. That means you drop the concentration of CO2 1 part per million every year, provided you're not putting more in. It's a very ambitious goal globally, but the research that I've done and others suggest that that is eminently achievable. What do we need to achieve it? A carbon price is going to be hugely helpful. We need that period of stability over the next cycle or two of government. But beyond that, we need a big innovation fund. You've seen what great things the Clean Energy Finance Corporation has done in this country. They've driven so much positive change. If we had a fund for innovation around carbon negative and carbon neutral technologies, say on the order of $5–10 billion, maybe more, we would be fostering that economy that is based on breathing in the pollution and storing it. It's not the whole solution, but it's an important part of it. There's some other really important jobs to do, and Gillian was so spot on with some of what she said. The people who are trying to prevent action on climate change benefit most when we are at odds with each other across our society. There is no doubt about that. That's why those same forces tend to foment issues, religious issues, racial issues and so forth. It suits the powers that be sometimes to have us at odds with each other. In the climate area, we can really do something about that. And I just want to take a second to talk about the French Revolution of all things, because the last time I can think of when society was facing such a struggle was probably pre-revolutionary France. At that time, when the king knew that he was right on the edge of losing power, he sent commissioners out throughout France to produce a register of complaints. They went to every village, every small area, and asked about the laws. What were the laws that were causing the greatest problems? What were the indignities visited on people? And this register was created. And if it had been acted on, maybe the outcome in France would have been different. But we need to do something like that listening exercise here. We need to go out to those communities who are still dependent on coal and listen to what they're saying. Hear what are the things that are really at the basis of their insecurity and their concern. What do they want for their future? We, people who are concerned for the environment in the big cities, we might think we know, but we need to consult very genuinely with those people so they know that they are being heard, and then to empower them to start betterment, to start dealing with the problems that they have. There is lots and lots of models for this, but we need to own this as a people. We need to own a means of reconciliation, one with the other, as we make this shift from a dirty economy to a clean one. If we don't do that, we will sacrifice some of our fellow Australians and their livelihoods unnecessarily. Now, it's a very difficult discussion to have, because a lot of people won't admit that coal is dead yet. But you go out to those communities and talk to people. They've lived through huge change already. The job losses are monumental. They're ready for this. They are ready to be heard and to engage with us, with society as a whole, in building a better future for themselves. So they're not enemies. These are people, fellow Australians, we need to work with, in my view. I think that as we look into the future, we have to take that holistic view. We have to deal with equality. We have to deal with our Indigenous people. We have to deal with the problems that refugees face. We only have each other. That's all we have in this world. I'm sorry, I'm not a religious person. My strength comes from my fellow human beings. And the basic element of decency in terms of dealing with them is absolutely central to my yardstick of how I measure myself. And I think that that's something we need across our society and across our politics. Very hard to do from one side, I know, but let's start tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. And of course, as you've probably gathered by now, the people who are joining us speaking tonight are here precisely because they're not members of Parliament, members of the Greens. They're here to give you their own independent vision. But there was one prerequisite we asked, which was that we only invited people who had been attacked by the Australian. So thanks very much for that, Tim. We really appreciate you joining us. And I think it's just worth pausing and noting the significance of what Tim was saying, that we don't only need to become a zero pollution society as quickly as possible, but to have any chance of meeting what we signed up to in Paris, we've got to actually start pulling the pollution out of the atmosphere. And meanwhile, we've got governments that are debating how much money can we give to build new coal-fired power stations. But I'm glad that we're here having this discussion tonight. And can I ask you now to put your hands together again from someone who you've heard from before, who's now going to come up and tell you a bit about her story, Emily Wuramara.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, hello. You can hear me. Okay, cool. Getting alpha, everyone. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and where we're gathered here today and pay my respects to the elders both past, present and future. My name is Emily Wuramara and I'm a singer-songwriter and a proud Wananslioka woman from Groot Island and Biggerton Island. Sorry, I don't usually do speeches, I'm a singer. So but I was asked to talk today about what my vision is for Australia, and it's a pretty huge question to ask yourself. But I come from a very multicultural background. My dad is Filipino, Spanish and Chinese, and my mum, she's Aboriginal, African, Native American and Cuban descent. And I identify very strongly with my Indigenous culture and sing in both my language, Ananslioka, and English, about things that are close to my heart. For me, growing up, we were always outside doing things like camping and fishing. We're on a dinghy to another island or, just surrounded by nature. But I believe nature is very healing and it heals not only your spirit, but your soul, your body and your mind. It's the law of my culture to respect our mother and nurture her. And I believe that we were put here as caretakers, not of just the land, but the sea as well. But sadly, we're destroying a lot of sacred history that has been here for thousands and thousands of years. The sacred trees that are being destroyed for a highway here in New South Wales, the Great Barrier Reef is dying, and we've built a mine near the Galileo Basin, the plastic that's being washed up on the shores and killing our sea creatures, and the fracking in NT, it's something that needs big noise, and there needs to be something done about that. So I do hope that my children and my great-grandchildren get to see this beautiful land and get to swim in this lovely sea. Because the preservation of our land and the preservation of our animals is as crucial to everyday Australians as a baby in her bottle. For my people, this land was once and still is a market. The way plants can be utilised as medicine, the way trees grow here, the kangaroos and the emus that roam these plains. There's no other place like this country. And I hope that this doesn't disappear for our future generations. But to be honest, I'd rather a frangipani over a diamond any day. The song I sang before was called Lady Blue, and it's something that's very close to my heart. It's a dedication not only to the sea, but to my grandmother. My grandmother was a huge influence in my music. She was a painter and an artist. I used to love watching her paint and how patient she was with her paintings. But thinking back now, I wish that I asked her many more questions about my culture and her story and her history. It's so important to sit with our elders and hear their wisdom. I have so much love in my heart for grandmothers. They teach you really good lessons. I hope that one day we have a treaty and my culture and people can be recognised and celebrated for their history, struggle, triumph and identity that has whispered these lands for tens of thousands of years. That my strong sisters, mothers, aunties, nieces and granddaughters can walk without being questioned on their actions and on their words. That they can walk around without feeling like there's some piece of meat or feel like they're a token. See, I come from a very traditional culture where we still have a hierarchy and where we still have arranged marriages. As a woman, I know we are sacred beings. We give life to the future. We hold sacred stories and songs that our grandmothers have passed down to us. We come from a line of strong, fierce women and it runs in our blood. Mastering it is the hard part. But I hope one day we have a female Prime Minister that shows this country true leadership and true strength, and she'll bring the voices of her ancestors and absolutely blow us away. I hope deep down in my heart that our future government listen and talk and communicate and start listening to the grandchildren of the voices that their ancestors silenced, because at the end of the day, all voices matter, of course. If you think about it, we're one big island on this planet, in a big universe made up of other planets, and here we are surviving. I ask myself sometimes, what can I do? What can I do to make a big impact? Because people don't remember the words you leave or how much money you had on your bank account. They remember you by the way you make them feel. And at the end of the day, I'm human. I laugh, I cry, I get cranky, I get tired, but that's just like every other human. I'm someone's auntie, someone's niece, someone's grandmother, someone's sister, and so are you. You're something to someone. So my vision for Australia is love. Love for all. Love for yourself. Love for your trees that grow in the backyard. Love for the songlines that run through this country like veins. And most of all, love for our people, our mob, and our family. Thank you.
Emily, well, for someone who says they don't usually give speeches, that was amazing. And if you want to add to your singer-songwriter and speech giver list parliamentarian and perhaps be someone who becomes that first female Prime Minister who cares one day, give us a call. That was incredible. One of the things that I know drives many people to politics and to strive to make Australia better is that we live in a country where increasingly the rule of law seems to be expendable, and where whole areas like the whole of Australia is no longer included in the migration zone for Australia, where people are defined as being less than human or being illegal, which justifies them being given less rights than the people that they're sharing this country with. In amongst all of that, we've been fortunate enough to have in Australia, but especially here in Melbourne, someone who has always stood up for the core values of the rule of law and for the importance that should come from being human and the rights that should attach to being human. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce to you someone who's going to give his vision for Australia, Julian Burnside.
Thanks, Adam. When I was asked to fill in, I'm actually the pretend Gillian Triggs tonight. When I was asked to fill in for Gillian, I was asked to give my vision for a future. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea, actually. A future is a really good idea. We should all support the idea of a future for this country. But if we're going to do that, we do need to take climate change seriously. There are many issues facing all of us, but our existence as a species is probably the most important. Now, I mean, you've all heard what Tim said, and I can't pretend to compete with Tim when it comes to talking about climate change, but I think climate change is actually the #1 issue facing our species at the moment. Refugees are if anything, a second-order issue. They just happen to be the issue that I'm mostly concerned with. But let's make sure we have a future. Now, some people complain, people like Tony Abbott and so on, complain that doing something sensible about climate change will mean that power prices go up. Well, duh. Is that too much of a sacrifice to make for our children and our grandchildren? I think the climate change debate goes a little bit like this. The people who are on my side and Tim's side of the debate would say, well, 97% of the world's climate scientists think that it's real and dangerous and at least in part anthropogenic, and we can do something about it. And the climate skeptics will say, yeah, but scientific truth isn't proved by majority vote, and that is true. Witness Galileo. But then the response to that ought to be, okay, well, let's give it an 80% chance that all the climate scientists are wrong. All of them. 80% chance says they're all wrong. Only 20% chance of it coming home. But if that 20% comes in, the result is avoidable and catastrophic. But 20% chance of an avoidable catastrophic outcome is worse odds than Russian roulette. So go and play Russian roulette with your kids and your grandkids. Or would you rather just pay a little bit more for electricity in the meantime? I think it's pretty easy to answer that. If you want a vision for the future, let's make sure we start by having a future. Then, if we're going to have a future, there's an interesting consequence to all of this, actually. If we ignore it, then in a few generations, half a dozen generations maybe, all of us will be history, we'll be toast. The major population centres of the earth will be wiped out. There will be some human survivors, for sure. The Kalahari Bushmen, for example, the Inuit, for example, the Outback Aborigines, for example. So the climate change deniers, if listened to, may actually be responsible for giving Emily's people their land back. I don't think that's what they intend, but it's another future. If we are to have a future of the sort of some kind of continuation of the present, then I would like to think that our generation will be remembered by the future as a generation that acted decently in the ways that Gillian Triggs was urging, that we did not treat innocent human beings as if they were criminals. Since September 11, 2001, the coalition forces in this country have called boat people illegals, even though they don't commit any offence. And we lock them up indefinitely, even though they've committed no offence and had no trial. And we treat them like criminals because it suits our politicians to do that. If you want a vision for the future, what about politicians who look beyond their immediate self-interest, who look beyond the immediate interest in being re-elected, who look beyond the interests of their commercial supporters? I think that would be good. But more than that, I'd like to see the future remembering our generation as a generation that decided that treating innocent human beings decently was a good idea. I got involved in this refugee thing because I was concerned about the way individual refugees were being treated. I have now become more concerned about the existential issue. What sort of country are we living in? And what sort of country do we want to live in? Do we really want to live in a country that will deliberately punish innocent children? The children on Nauru right now, 110 or 120 of them, suffering, some of them try to kill themselves. It is a stain on this generation. It's beyond belief that we can comfortably sit back and applaud politicians from both parties while they simply go along with the idea that innocent human beings will be punished for their political advantage. That's the way it's working. But the other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind for the future, and is part of what I would hope is a vision for the future, and seems to be part of the Greens' vision for the future, and that is support for the arts. Because if we are to have a future, I wonder how we will be remembered. Will we be remembered as a generation which left a layer of soot in the archaeological history of the arts? It's a very interesting thing to imagine. It's just a thought experiment, but just imagine yourself in a room of 40 or 50 people of fair intelligence and reasonable education. Give them a list of names drawn from the last half dozen centuries, and I guarantee you that disproportionately they'll recognise the names of composers, painters, sculptors, poets. They will not recognise the names of lawyers, accountants, politicians, probably, maybe a couple of wicked ones. But the artists will be remembered because the arts do something which make our survival somehow more valuable. So a future vision for this country must involve us surviving, must involve us treating our fellow human beings decently, and should involve us supporting the arts because, after all, that's what we are supposed to be about. The arts are the one thing human beings can do that other creatures on this earth cannot do. So let's see what we can do to support the arts. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Well, I think it's undoubtedly true. The scientists have spoken, and it's over to the rest of us in the humanities to sort out the mess and hopefully make the world a better place along the way. Here in Victoria, we are pretty lucky to have probably, I think, I haven't checked this, but I think probably more Greens MPs than any other state. And we've got our leader, Sam Ratnam, and Deputy Leader, Nina Springle, who've come along here tonight, who hopefully, if we all do our jobs right, will be sitting in balance of power in both houses at the Victorian State Parliament by the end of the year, which would be a pretty good Christmas present, I reckon. And someone else who I'm very proud to call a colleague and who I think you've all come along here tonight to hear what the Greens' vision is on so many of these big pressing issues facing us. Please put your hand together for the Victorian Greens Senator and Leader, Richard Di Natale.
Thanks so much, Adam. Let me begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay respects to elders past and present. Let's acknowledge we are standing here today, you're sitting here today on stolen land. This is Aboriginal land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. Let me also acknowledge all of our terrific guests who have come along to support us tonight. We thank you greatly for your incredible contributions. I want to acknowledge all of my parliamentary colleagues as well, state and federal colleagues, and of course all of you for coming along tonight. I'm really grateful that we could share this evening together. It's been a pretty crazy few weeks. Some of you probably saw that I let off a bit of steam in Parliament last week. I was a little annoyed. Actually, I was bloody angry, really. I was bloody angry. I was angry at that spectacle that passes for federal politics. I was angry at that self-interested rabble who care more about themselves, who care more about settling, old scores and getting vengeance and payback than they care about the people who actually elected them to that place. Bloody angry that we have for 10 years had this revolving door of prime ministers because not one of them's had the guts to stand up to the coal lobby and say, we need to take urgent action, we need to take it now when it comes to climate change. Angry that these guys are more interested in looking after their corporate mates than they are in looking after the community. And what was that about? What actually was achieved last week? We've got this new Prime Minister, right? This is a guy who seems to be proud of the cruel and inhumane treatment that he dished out to those innocent people in offshore hellholes. This is a man who said to grieving families, we're not going to let you attend the funeral of your dead children. He's now our Prime Minister. He walked into the Parliament brandishing a lump of coal, and in that act, you know what he said to the whole community? He said, I'm here to govern for the coal lobby. I'm not here to represent you. What does he say? He takes on the gig and he says, my first priority is drought. But he can't mouth the words climate change. And now we've got a new energy minister, some bloke who's been running around the country campaigning against wind farms and against any support for renewable energy. We've got special envoys, Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce. Remember, this is the Liberals' new generation. Right? This mob is looking less like a party of government and more like One Nation every day. No wonder we're all angry. We've got a right to be angry. But you know what? Anger isn't enough. It's not enough to get angry. We've got to focus that anger. And that's what tonight's about. So I want to thank you all for coming along. I want to thank those people who are watching online right around the country for being part of our campaign for a better future, to chart a different future. A future where people are treated equally, where wealth isn't concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. A future where we protect and restore our environment, where we look after each other, where we recognise the environment's not something to be exploited for the greed of a few corporations. And you know what? I believe that's what most people want for this country. I believe that's what most Australians want. They share that vision for the future of this country. I couldn't do this job if I didn't believe that. And I know that it's a future it's within reach. We can achieve it. If we work together, if we harness all of the energy of the people in this room and the passion of people right around the country, we can create that future. We can. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how I got here, right? So I'm the kid of Italian immigrants. My mum and dad came in the 60s, post-war Italy, came here with nothing. Dad, learned English while he was doing his apprenticeship as an electrician. Mum came with her folks. She had a couple of years of school here. She got pulled out of school and worked in our family milk bar and grocery shop. Like lots of migrant kids, my family, my uncles, my aunties, my friends, they were factory workers, some of them were out workers. They all worked bloody hard to create a life for themselves. Then, through the 80s and 90s, we had this huge disruption. The economy really changed for people. And what happened through that time is, as the economy changed, a lot of people lost their jobs. They struggled through the recession we had to have. Some of them didn't recover. And right through that period, we kept being told, give it time. We're all going to be better off in the long run, just give it time. Well, we're 30 years down the track, more. It's a pretty long run. What's happened? Income share of the top 1%'s doubled. We've got the same number of Australians who are living in poverty right now as we had 30 years ago. We've got chronic unemployment and underemployment. Seen huge increases in the cost of essential services, whether it's banking, energy, telecommunications, housing. The only thing that hasn't gone up over that period is people's wages. No wonder people are angry. So you have to ask yourself, how did we actually get here? What went wrong? And the short answer is, we were sold a lie. This was all a lot of self-interested bullshit. For decades, we were told, if you shrink the size of government, if you privatise essential assets, if you cut taxes and regulation, if you get rid of unions, we're all going to be better off. Neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, economic rationalism, trickle-down economics, you can call it what you like, right? We were told that government was the problem and that what's good for business is automatically good for people. So what do you get? Now you've got the coal lobby writing our energy policy. You've got the business lobby writing tax policy. You've got media companies that write our media laws. And don't worry, it's a badge of honour if the Australians had a go at you, Tim. You've got multinationals now who treat tax like it's some optional extra. We don't have a tax system in Australia anymore. We've got a tax avoidance system. You've got some of these big companies, they price gouge, they commit fraud. They usually get away with it. Hell, if you're a bank, you can charge dead people and make money off that. So, we've got CEOs and senior executives who've done great out of this. They're the big winners. Of course they are. They wrote the rules to serve themselves. What's it done for people, for us? Public hospital waiting lists blowing out. People waiting for days in an emergency department. Schools that are overcrowded. People can't get a place in an aged care facility. And we are now in an ecological crisis of a scale that has not been seen before. Right? The Arctic's melting. We're about to lose the Great Barrier Reef. The Murray-Darling's running dry. You see, that's what happens when you've got decades of corporate influence over our political leaders corrupting the public good. No wonder people are angry. And it's that anger that leads to the rise of people like Donald Trump and Pauline Hanson and Brexit in the UK, and to their brand of politics, right? Their brand of politics, it manufactures this fiction that it's all the fault of migrants, all the fault of those brown people from overseas. And they pretend to speak for people who have been left behind. Well, what a bunch of hypocrites. What a bunch of hypocrites. Look at what Donald Trump does. He stands up there. We're going to drain the swamp. We're going to govern for, the people, not for the Washington elite. So he gets elected, what does he do? Hands a massive tax cut to corporate America. He repeals healthcare for people who can least afford it. I mean, Pauline Hanson, for goodness sake, I'm with her when we're in Parliament. She sides with the Liberals to cut taxes and cut services for people, to deliver tax cuts for wealthy Australians, and everyone else can go to hell. It's not hard to see where the next election's going to go. You know, it's going to be an election that's going to be fought fear and greed. They're going to be the two drivers in this election. You're going to have fear in the form of, you know, an attack on migrants, despite the fact that multiculturalism is one of the great assets of this country. You know, when people attack, you know, migrants, I take it really personally. It feels like they're attacking me and my family and the millions of families just like them. You're going to have greed in the form of tax bribes. They're not going to solve any of the real economic issues that face Australians, and they're going to leave corporate power untouched. That's what they're going to do. So we can't be diverted by this sort of cynical and calculated race baiting that's intended to turn neighbour against neighbour. And what it's meant to do is to distract you from where the real problems lie. I mean, the real problem is that we've got a political culture in this country that's based on short-term self-interest that allows big corporate interests to use their economic power to control our politics. That's the problem. And we're going to have to fight like hell to end it. Look, our first priority has to be to turf this mob out. Right? That's got to be our first priority. This mob don't deserve to govern. We've got to boot them out. And we'll work with a new Labor government to get climate action back on track. We will do that. But we know it's not enough. Like, it doesn't matter who's in charge. They're not going to stand up to their corporate donors or the big end of town. We know that, right? They're going to let that Adani mine go ahead and destroy the Great Barrier Reef. They're going to let oil companies into the Great Australian Bight. Deep sea oil drilling in one of the most precious wilderness places left on earth. They're going to continue their cash for access at their business forums so that energy companies, the mining companies, the gambling lobby can write their policies for them. They've already said they're not going to increase New Start or youth allowance, so they're going to condemn people to living a life of poverty. They're not going to close those camps and bring those innocent people who are being tortured right now here to Australia. So business as usual is not going to cut it. Right? We need something else. We need a genuine alternative. We've got to have a plan where we look after people, where we stand up for the environment, and where we think about the future. And this is what the plan looks like. I want to tell you a bit about our plan, our vision. It starts with silencing those voices of big corporations who have bought a seat at the policy table and are saying to the rest of us here, you can have a few scraps. So no more corporate donations. End of story, right? No more. You know that corporations have given over $100 million to both sides of politics over less than the last decade, right? $100 million. Who reckons they give it because they want to see democracy flourish in Australia? Actually, someone actually said that to me once with a straight face. Why do they do it? They do it because it's a business transaction, it's an investment, and they get a good return on that investment. That's why they do it. We've got to close the revolving door between Parliament and industry by banning politicians and senior staff from holding conflicting roles as lobbyists for at least 5 years. We've got to close that revolving door. We're going to introduce a national anti-corruption watchdog, right? And you know what? They're going to be pretty bloody busy. You know where they can start? They can start with a $500 million grant to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. That's a who's who of the fossil fuel industry. They can start with the corruption and theft that's going on around the Murray-Darling Basin right now. They can start with those orchestrated raids on union offices. You know what? The media were there before the police. What does that tell you? And what about immigration visas for political donations? A national anti-corruption watchdog will be pretty busy, by my reckoning. We've got to do more than that. We've got to shake up our parliament. I look at the makeup of a parliament. Sometimes I look up at the Senate and the House of Reps. It's mostly older, privileged white Anglo blokes. And then I look at the Australian census. It's like they're two different countries. Yeah, we've got to have a parliament that reflects the diversity of the Australian community. We've got to have more people of colour, more people with disability, single parents, artists, scientists, young people. We're going to have a parliament that reflects the Australian community, and only when we do that and we get rid of those massive corporate donations are we going to be able to change, our economy so that it works for people and not corporation. That starts with reform of the tax system. A tax system's at the heart of our economy, and it's not up to the job. Our tax reform plan is based on three key principles. We'll collect tax so we can raise revenue to pay for the things we need, so that we can redistribute wealth and create a more equal society through the tax and transfer system. And we'll tax things that are harmful and encourage those things that we want more of. And because we're guided by those principles, we'll raise enough revenue for the essential services that everyone needs and deserves. We'll make sure people aren't living in poverty. We'll make sure everyone in this country has a roof over their head. We won't cut personal income tax rates to a point where if you are an executive earning $200,000, under this government, you now pay the same tax rate as a childcare worker or a graduate nurse. That's what they want under their plan. We'll stamp out the use of tax havens and we'll reform family trusts to stop tax minimisation. We'll introduce a minimum tax rate. It's called a Buffett rule. What it does is it makes sure that everyone pays a baseline level of tax. It doesn't matter how many dodgy deductions they use. We'll end those handouts, we'll close loopholes, we'll reverse those tax cuts for the wealthy, and we'll oppose any further corporate tax cuts. Right now, and I had to double check this stat, 1 in 3 of Australia's biggest companies pays no tax at all. That's 1 in 3, right? That multinational tax avoidance, it's going to cost the Australian economy $60 billion over the next 10 years. Just stop for a minute and think about what could you do with $60 billion? That's the entire NBN. It's all of the HECS debt owed by everybody in this country. You could put university and TAFE within the reach of everybody. You could have Medicare-funded dental care so that going to the dentist is just like going to the doctor. We're a wealthy country. It's an indictment that people don't want to go out at night because they're so ashamed of the way they look. We could build 500,000 affordable homes and we could eradicate homelessness in this country once and for all. Could build a world-class public transport system, ease congestion, connect communities, reduce pollution. Could eliminate waste and stem the tide of plastics that's clogging up our oceans. We could do all of those things, right? We could do all of them. The sort of things that a country like Australia has always been able to do and always been able to achieve. We've just got to make our economy work for us, not the other way around. Our plan also creates publicly owned companies to compete with private companies so that we deliver better services and lower prices. Novel idea. That's why we support a publicly owned bank, a people's bank, that's focused on customers rather than profits. Publicly owned energy and telecommunications infrastructure, and of course we'll fund our public broadcasters, the ABC and SBS. They can show the corporate media what real journalism looks like. You know, a lot of critics say, oh, these big companies, they're too big, they're too powerful, they're untouchable. But we heard that before. The Greens were a lonely voice in the call for a banking royal commission. When we came out with that call years ago, after hearing the litany of stories about how banks were ripping people off, first we were ignored, then they laughed at us, that's just the Greens, Then they started to attack us, then they did it, right? Now we're the first party to put forward a plan about how we're going to actually reform the banking system. It's based on the principle that a bank should operate for its customers, right? We're going to force banks to be banks again. We're going to break them up. We're going to put a decent regulator in charge, the ACCC. We can do all of those things. And of course, when it comes to climate change, an existential threat, right? It's an existential threat. It sits above everything else. We're the only party with a serious plan to transition away from coal into a renewable energy future. It's a comprehensive plan for jobs. They're just solar jobs, not coal jobs. It's a plan that's going to bring down emissions and it'll bring down prices because that's what renewables do. The economy and the environment are now working in the same direction. And Tim, you're absolutely right. Most coal workers, they know what's going on. They see this. They know what's coming. They've been through it before. And that's why we're committed to support them through a transition into the industries of the future. Not just for them, but for their kids. Over the coming months, we're going to be sharing more of our vision for the next election. And not just for the next election, but beyond that, in the decades ahead. It's a vision based on some key principles, like the fact that everything is connected. That you can't take shortcuts today because the consequences will come back harder on the next generation. That science and knowledge and expertise, that's something to be valued, not something to be ridiculed. That we do need to explore new ideas. We have to innovate. We've got to support innovation. We can't get stuck in our old ways, dogmatically doing what we've always done, because it's just not going to work. It's guided on the principle that we need to build this future for everybody, not just for a select few. And it's a future that could bring us more, not less. We would spend less time stressed and struggling to make ends meet, and more time doing the things we love, spending time with each other, connecting with nature. A future where our precious places are protected. One that's more hopeful, more inclusive. One that's got a place for everyone. Don't let anyone tell you can't do it, right? Just don't let them tell you that, because we can. We are, all of us, the ones who can do it. All of us together, working in our communities, connecting people, organising, doing what we can to make sure there are voices in Parliament who stick to their principles. People who are there to achieve big things, big reforms, not just to get a big office. People who won't change their position after they're elected because the big donor comes knocking on the door. The Greens are that voice. We are your voice. We can turn things around together. We absolutely have to, because our future depends on it. Thanks, everyone. Now, before I finish tonight, I want to share a short video with you. It's a message that involves our supporters from right across the country. So I want to leave you with this.
Together, we can ensure everyone has what they need to live a good life.
Together, we can ensure no one is left behind.
Together we can create a sustainable future for our children.
A future where we put people before profit.
A future where we choose hope over fear.
A future where our environment is protected, not exploited.
We have a choice. It's a choice between the politics of yesterday
And a future for all of us.
That's actually the first time I've seen that. It's bloody good, isn't it? Well done to the people who made that. I'm going to leave you now with Adam. When I gave my first speech in Parliament, I quoted Martin Luther King, who said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I still believe it. But one thing I've learned, I reckon, over the last nearly 10 years of being in this job is we don't bend it, you bend it, right? We're all in this together. We can build a different future. We can build something else. The power doesn't lie with us, Adam, or any of our Greens colleagues. It sits with everybody in this room, people watching right around the country. With the collective, it sits with the movement, it sits with you. So let's kick this mob out. Let's build a genuine alternative, because it's up to us. Thanks, everyone.
You're going to sit down. You're going to sit down. Thanks, Richard. I'm going to invite, now's your chance, and we've got a few questions that have come through. I'm going to invite our panellists or our speakers to come up and join us here. And there's one person who you haven't heard from yet who's also going to come and join us on stage. She's a household name, I think, in Australia. She's got 6 solo albums under her belt, plus a few others. And if that wasn't enough to make you full of admiration, she wrote one book that came out a couple of years ago that found its way onto various shortlists, and has got another one, I think, coming out in a month or so. So please join all our panellists, thank all our panellists, and also welcome Holly Throsby to the stage. Thanks, everyone. So we've got a few questions that have come through, and we'll throw it open to all of you, this first one. But maybe, Julian and Richard, you might like to start us off on this one. This is from Anne, who's in the audience, and she's asked something that I think is on many people's minds. What do you think is the most effective way of destroying the current government's despicable policy about indefinite detention? Is there a way to force the government to bring them here?
Yes. I'm actually working on a top secret plan which will make offshore processing a thing of the past.
Excellent.
If it succeeds.
Very good.
and it does not depend. It does not depend on the Greens taking government.
Look forward to hearing it. I can share with you, and probably with the rest of the room as well, that we've announced this afternoon that when Parliament resumes, we're going to be moving a motion of no confidence in Peter Dutton over his misleading Parliament over the visas. And Labor's going to support it, as will at least some of the other crossbenchers. So we're a couple of votes away. So I hope your plan, if we can get Peter Dutton to stand down, I hope it makes it a bit easier to implement your plan. Anyone else want to chime in on that? It's a big question.
It's a big question, isn't it? I think you've got to throw everything at it. So it's great having people like Julian. Obviously, I'm assuming your grand plan involves some legal tactic.
Afraid so.
Whatever we've got to throw everything at it. And I think, I think the politics of it need to change. And I just come back to the fundamental point that while there is political mileage to be made out of it, and the sad reality is there is, then it's going to be very difficult to change that. And so we need to expose what's going on. I have a genuine, again, belief that the reason this policy succeeds and endures is because we are so removed from it that we don't connect with what's actually going on. And the whole policy is designed to create this cloak around it that can't be penetrated. Because if you start connecting with the 12-year-old girl who's in detention and hear about her story and start to understand that she's a person, not just some line in a story, then it's very difficult to continue to prosecute what the government's been doing. So the whole reason that this policy endures is because we don't connect with them as people. And we've got to try to do everything we can to break that down. And I think it's important then to do what we can in our communities to make sure that there aren't any more votes in it. Because while there are votes in it, unscrupulous governments like the one we've had at the moment that dates all the way back to John Howard, and weak oppositions will take us where we've got to today.
It's a matter of shame that the public generally does not recognise this. In October 2002, Australia signed up to the International Criminal Court. I had a read of the Greens' policy position today, and I'm glad to see that it involves strengthening the International Criminal Court, because as part of us signing up to it, we had to introduce into our domestic law various crimes over which the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction under the Statute of Rome. So from October 2002, in Australia, we now have a law making genocide a crime. It wasn't before that. And various crimes against humanity. And if you look at some of the crimes against humanity in our law, what our politicians are doing to refugees is a crime against humanity contrary to our law. And if the sooner the public understand that, the sooner they're likely to say, well, that's a bridge too far, we're not going to put up with it. So I hope you can strengthen the International Criminal Court so it can start jumping on a few political heads in Australia.
There's a few people there whose tickets I'd pay for to go over and appear there as defendants. Vivian has a question about the arts and about artists, and she asks, artists have a long history of activism but are also an essential part of our cultural and social well-being. What role can artists play in building a better future?
Keep on being artists.
I'd like to have a go at that.
They should just keep on being artists.
Hello? I don't even know if this is on. Hello? Turn on. Hello, hello. Hello. Oh, there.
Hello, testing. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Work.
I agree with you, Julian. I think artists should just continue to make art. I think artists generally react emotionally to the state of the world, and there's a lot to react against at the moment. I think some thing that government, though, could do in terms of cultural policy for the arts and to have a clear cultural policy, there certainly has been a lot of calls for that, and I think seeing an Australian government adopt a cultural policy and actually start funding the arts more readily would certainly help artists who really don't make much money. I mean, you have to be at the very, very top of the arts world to make a living. That's about this much, and then the rest of the artists is about everyone else you've ever heard of, and they've all got other jobs. So it would be wonderful to see more support from government as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too. But I'm an Indigenous singer-songwriter, so being Indigenous automatically comes with politics, and it's a struggle sometimes, I find, to really get my message out there, because not a lot of people want to hear those messages. You know, when you say something, it's like, oh, that's too much. I can't deal with that right now. Or that's too much politics. I don't really want to listen to that right now. And so it's about sharing and exploiting those artists that are talking about those issues and who are singing about these things, and making them aware to the wider Australian public, because not a lot of people know, and it's just about who's in the know, I guess.
There's an interesting comment about the arts in one of Tom Stoppard's plays. He says that in any community of 1,000 people, there'll be 900 doing the work, 90 doing well, 9 doing good, and 1 lucky person's an artist. And the only thing that I would criticise in that is that the person who's an artist is not lucky. It's just because we treat them pretty badly here, and we should treat them better. Melbourne, I think, is a great exception in Australia's environment. Melbourne is very arts friendly, but I'm very glad to see that the Greens policy actually emphasises the arts. I look forward to the day when arts are fully appreciated in this country, because they actually make it worthwhile living. We need to understand that.
And we've got Jennifer in the audience has a question for you, Tim. I work in renewable energy, and the past weeks have been incredibly stressful. But I also work directly with communities who can't stand wind and solar and just want us to use coal. What do you say to those people who aren't interested in a future for everyone, but they also have a right to the lifestyle they choose in this country?
Look, I must say I haven't had that experience of working with communities who just want coal. I mean, the people that I've worked with in coal communities, they want clean air just like the rest of us. They want independence, they want some autonomy around their energy supply. So having solar panels on your roof gives you control. Everyone wants control over their budget, over that sort of thing. So I would say to people particularly, look, you haven't been served well so far by the energy transition. We've seen massive loss of jobs in some of these communities and real regional poverty. And you see it, you go to some of those coal communities and they're depressed. There's very few opportunities for people. And I think we've got to say that you deserve a better deal than that. And part of that better deal is going to be a shift to the clean energy economy. But also we understand that we owe you as a community a special plan, because you are the ones who are disproportionately carrying the burden on behalf of all of us as we move to address this issue.
We went to coal-fired power station communities around the country to talk about our plan to move out of coal, and we walked in there as Greens saying we want to shut down the coal-fired power station, come to a public meeting, and they did, and they turned up, and some blokes in high-vis vests sat there with their arms crossed all the way through, gave us glaring looks, and then at the end came up and said, look, don't agree with everything you say, but you're the only ones being honest with us at the moment, and thanks for having the honest conversation.
Very much my experience too, and can I just say, places like the Latrobe Valley, you go there and people say, look, the social compact was broken years ago. It used to be everyone had a job in the Latrobe Valley, with the SEC. That's long gone. Now, a few of us have got a job, a lot of us are unemployed, and we've still got the pollution. We're still living with all of the downside of it.
Now, it's not even 8 o'clock, but we're on to revolutions. Tim, who's watching online, says, as a member of the generation who will be left to fix the world, how do we begin to mobilise a revolution which is disenfranchised by the system within which we live?
It's a big question, isn't it? Just get organised, get involved, turn up, do all of the things that involve you making change. Like there's not one action, and for some people it'll be different for everybody, but you've got to show up. Like that's the main thing. And you're all showing up tonight, you're all here because you actually want to be part of it. And what we need to do is keep building this movement. And unless we, until we can create that momentum, then we're stuck with the policies that have been dished out for far too long. So part of what we're doing tonight, part of what you're doing, is you're taking that first step. You're here because you want to be involved and you want to be part of that movement. And as I said, it's not going to be politicians or lawyers or indeed academics that are going to change things. I mean, we are part of it, but the history of change is one that reflects the fact that significant changes happen through social movements, and that's what we need to build. We've just got to keep building it.
and at the risk of going over the edge in terms of my knowledge of politics, which is zero, my knowledge of history, which is limited, most revolutions happen because people are driven to look for change because their future depends on it. Well, act like your future depends on it, because it does.
Now, Elisha, who's watching online, says, my question's for everyone, but I particularly love to hear from Emily. Treaties and constitutional recognition are a vital step in the right direction, but how else do the Greens intend to combat the severe inequalities and discrepancies between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians? What needs to happen, and how's it going to happen?
Oh, is that for me? Oh, it's a big question.
Wow.
My goodness. Well, you know, it's hard for me to talk about that because I come from an island in like the middle of nowhere, and so I'm very unfamiliar with. I acknowledge the struggles that my people have been through treaty and constitutional recognition, but I'm all for a treaty. You know, we deserve to be recognised separately from the community, the Australian community, because we have a separate history of what went on with my people, and you know, it needs to be acknowledged and respected and appreciated, because we have struggled and we still are struggling, and you know, I feel for the next generation, because the amount of inequality that's happening not just within Indigenous peoples but within peoples from all walks of life, from all walks of countries here in Australia, it's unfair and it's sad and it's plain cruel. So, yeah.
My most recent idea, which got me criticised by The Australian, was...
common theme tonight.
The thing was, I mean, Indigenous Australians represent, what, 2.7% of the population, give or take? And they have been driven to a point of desperation because, first of all, the land which we acknowledge is theirs was taken from them by our ancestors, and we apparently aren't planning to give it back. And then we took their kids from them and redoubled the damage and all of that.
And it's still happening.
And it's still happening, yeah, okay. So, if they are 2.7% of the land, what about a once-off 2.7% capital tax on the value of the land that we took? And put that money aside in a special account which can only be used to support Aboriginal communities. I kind of like the idea because it meets the symbolism of the occasion, and it also would be a practical benefit. It would raise hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. Gerard Henderson, bless his heart, got stuck into me in The Australian and observed that he didn't notice me offering to give back my house. Well, actually, that kind of misses the point.
Could I just say, I could see the benefit of that, but for me there's a really fundamental problem, which is that we took power from Aboriginal people, power over their lives, over their land. And the really successful initiatives I've seen in Australia is where we've given power back. So look at the data. You go to a place like Burke, where Aboriginal people are in control of their own data now, data on health and that sort of stuff. It's enormously empowering for those communities to have that. So for me, yes, doubtless people need more funding and a treaty and whatever. But really what they need most of all is power over their own lives. We've taken that away, and we must give it back as the key step to creating a better future.
I was just about to say the same thing, that I, when in a former life, working as a doctor, spent a couple of years working for an Aboriginal community-controlled health organisation in the Northern Territory. And, you know, went in there, I was late 20s, thought I knew everything, thought I had all the answers. Went in, and the one thing I learnt from that experience was, actually, you're only going to achieve change if you work with a community and empower them to drive the change. And that was the single most important lesson that I learnt, that it's actually about empowering people to actually drive the change and have some control and power over their own lives. And, I mean, following on from that, That's why having an Aboriginal voice within our parliament, constituted in that way, is so important. That's why the dismantling of ATSIC was such a retrograde step. We need to also recognise that you don't heal and move forward until you really acknowledge the past. And the apology was a really powerful moment, but there's a hell of a lot more work to do in that space. And we do need to acknowledge the truth on which this nation was built. And it was built on the theft of land. And we can't just keep pretending that didn't happen. And that means going back and working sovereignty and treaties. And that acknowledgement actually gives you a platform to move forward. And then I suppose the final thing I'd say is, you often hear, oh, well, money's not the answer, but it goes a long way to help. And in healthcare, there's this sort of mythology about, oh, we spend all this money on Aboriginal health. But actually, when you look at the burden of illness and look at how much we spend per person, it's not that different to how much we spend on people who aren't Indigenous. We underspend hugely when it comes to investing in the healthcare of Aboriginal people. So there's so much that we could do. The first thing is acknowledging the truth of what happened. And the second thing, I think, is recognising that it has to be led and owned by Aboriginal communities.
Can I add one thing about the apology to the stolen generations at the start of 2008? The only Aboriginal person in this country who's been found by a court to have been unlawfully taken from his parents and to have suffered damage as a result and to be compensated for that damage was a bloke called Bruce Trevorrow. I know his circumstances pretty well because I acted for him in the Supreme Court of South Australia. Bruce had two brothers, Tom and George Trevorrow, who were not taken because they didn't get sick and they weren't taken up to the Adelaide Children's Hospital. Tom and George Trevorrow grew up and became leaders of the Ngarrindjeri community down on the Coorong. When Kevin Rudd decided to make an apology to the stolen generations, he wanted some Aboriginal people in the public area of the lower house. And so Tom and George Trevorrow, as Aboriginal leaders, were invited. Bruce Trevorrow was not invited until we sent them a little reminder that here he was, the only bloke who'd actually been found by court to have been unlawfully taken. It's just maybe it shows that the whole... I mean, I thought the apology was pretty impressive, but maybe there was
Peter Dutton didn't show up.
Well, Peter Dutton's a worm. Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison. I mean, I couldn't believe it last week. I was actually relieved that Scott Morrison became Prime Minister. How does that work? But Dutton and Morrison are both dishonest hypocrites. Dishonest because they call boat people illegal, which is false. Hypocrites because they both pretend to be Christians and they're not. They are doing things that are so grossly un-Christian, it's beyond belief. And I have been saying that publicly for a few years now, and they haven't brought an action for libel. Take a lucky guess why.
It seems to me as well, just to finish off on this topic, that what us white Australians need to really do is just listen. Yeah. It seems like to Aboriginal voices and Aboriginal stories as much as we possibly can, because it seems to me, I mean, to go along with this idea of self-determination, which I think is crucial, first of all, we also need to really listen and shush probably for a bit.
Can I add on to that?
I was just going to make the point. Go for it.
I just wanted to tell you guys a little... Sorry. I just wanted to tell you guys a little story about this thing up at home we call the songlines in Northern Territory. And the songlines are what link each tribe. So there's a song that we sing. My songline is called Dumble, and that's the Morning Star songline. And it links each tribe. And it used to go all the way down to Tasmania, so we'd start up in NT and then you'd kind of gather all down in Tasmania and have a celebration. Well, my grandmother was on the last songlines trip and they stopped just at the border of New South Wales before continuing down, and there was a whole line of them. And my grandmother turned around and said to my mum, duck down and hide, because what you're going to see next isn't very nice. And so my mum did that, and when she peeked and had a look, there was just a line of women and men who were all gathered together, who were all standing there crying. And as a sign of respect for my mob up in NT, if we draw blood from us, that's showing respect to the land and showing our hurt and our sorrow for them. And so that's what was happening. People were hurting themselves because they couldn't stand the fact that the songs couldn't continue and we couldn't continue down and celebrate with our brothers and sisters in Tasmania or wherever, that we are proud and we're strong and resilient and we're still here today. And so, you need to start listening to us because our voices matter and we need to be heard. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. While you're there, Emily, and you've got the microphone, Tiffany in the audience wants to know, it's a question to both you and Holly, what are the contemporary issues that inspire you as songwriters, whether positive or negative, that you channel into song?
You can go first.
Well, I guess throughout my songwriting, I've generally been really interested in incredibly mundane and everyday issues. I kind of feel like we all live in the everyday, and to me, those are kind of the things. Identifying just moments, to me, is kind of how I've worked with songwriting. As I go through that, I'm more and more interested in human relationships and human psychology. It's interesting we talk about this sort of all this big stuff, how we fix these big problems, but to me it's sort of how do we fix ourselves in a lot of ways. And it's really hard when I think you probably have a lot of broken people that are in the parliament at the moment, because I don't really see whole healthy people would behave in this way. I feel like these are broken people who are just unfortunately kind of working out their issues in front of us. And so for me, I'm really interested in philosophy and psychology and a way that we can look in, which ultimately helps us to look out and find common humanity. That's what drives me as a writer of books and of songs.
Sorry. I'm 22 years old, so I haven't really lived much of my life yet. But what kind of drives me to do music and write songs is just the fact that I come from a line and a legacy of strong women who I feel I have a responsibility to be a leader and a spokeswoman for my people and the next generation. And so I write songs about environment, about protecting and preserving culture and identity and language, and also songs about healing not only for yourself but for your soul, for your mind and for your body, things that kind of take you back and so you can reflect about life. I'm only 22 and I'm saying that, but things that can take you back to when you were back in the days when all you had to do was just lie on a beach and look up at the sky. It's the simple things and the little things that matter, and it's the little things and the simple things that a lot of people take for granted. And those moments and those things should be treasured in our hearts. And so, I guess that's me. I'm a bit of a storyteller.
Excellent. And some great questions coming in from people who are watching online. Benita has, in a very short question, I think, posed a very big problem. How will we bring along those who fear change?
I think you, thinking about climate change specifically, we either do something or the change they fear will happen regardless. Just tell them all they're doing is helping avoid a catastrophic change. What really amazes me, and Tim didn't mention this, but we have known about the effect of carbon-based molecules in the atmosphere and its correlation with temperature. We've known that since 1896. 1896. It's unbelievable that we have managed to ignore it for so long. And I tell you what, the rate of change is really heading towards a cliff, And we don't want to be like the lemmings who go over the cliff, some shouting we are saved and others shouting we are lost.
I think in terms of dealing with those who fear change or are resistant to change, we need to set up mechanisms that help bring communities together through this. And in my experience as Climate Commissioner, I probably spoke to tens of thousands of Australians, in audiences a bit like this. Tried to make it special, tried to make it their night, and hear what they had to say. And I found generally when people came together to deliberate, you would get wise overall decisions or wise sentiments coming from people. So I think we have to bring people along together to create a sense of community, create a sense as much as we can of certainty for those people in their circumstance. That's a job for government. I think Richard giving them a sense that they'll be taken care of as the transition inevitably moves forward. Because we all have to, we can't stop the change. We've got to cope with it, whether it's the changing climate or the changing technologies that are giving us the opportunity to combat it. So to put people front and centre through that process, I think, and make them feel valued.
You're asking for politicians to become leaders.
Well, I think we all need to become politicians. We all need to become part of the process, part of the whole deliberative process, I think.
I think you're right in that if people feel they have a stake in the change that's happening, if they have agency in what's happening, then it becomes less like a change happening to them and more like a change that they're making themselves. And then if education happens so people understand which changes would be helpful, for example, then potentially more people will come on board. Yeah. But I would hazard that everybody fears change. It's just that change looks different for everybody, for different people.
We need a really big educative process, and one of the best models for doing that, I think, are these citizen juries, where you bring together 50 or 100 people, give them power to make a decision, and then ask them to deliberate and give them power to draw on whatever information that they need to make that decision wisely and deliberate for a number of days or week or whatever it takes. That, and if we as a society are bound by, the collective will that comes out of those things, it's tremendously powerful. I think no government can go against that sort of decision.
My recollection of history is that is what parliaments used to be.
Yes. The trouble is the cycle for representation has become decoupled with the reality on the ground of the voter.
And it's become less and less effective since Labor stopped being a party of the left. Yeah. Remember those times? Grey-haired people? Remember those times? We've just got two clones. They look like each other for the most part, and they try and differentiate themselves, but they're driven, as you know, by what the news polls are telling them. The Jim Hacker style of leadership. I'm their leader. I must follow them.
Just also to add, perhaps a note of optimism. A few years ago, I thought Australia was a long way from achieving marriage equality. And that seemed like a really intractable problem. Now, the way we got there wasn't how we should have got there, and that plebiscite inflicted a lot of harm on people. But when you have a national conversation, which you can have in an environment where you're not unleashing those sort of forces that were unleashed during the plebiscite, but having a more civil and open debate that doesn't put the rights of a small group on trial, I actually find that most people are open to change, and comes back to what you said, Holly. It's about actually listening, and we keep hearing, don't confuse. I've learnt this lesson. I never confuse what I read in mainstream papers with where the community's at. People are way ahead of politicians, and mainstream media's so busy in the little echo chamber of Canberra that they're very disconnected from where the community's at. And so I'm actually more optimistic about it. I think the challenge for us is to be able to engage with people through forums like this, through other channels, online channels, and while social media is often anti-social media, it also allows us to communicate to people in ways that we weren't able to previously. I gave that speech last week and it was pretty much ignored by the mainstream media, but millions of people saw it online. And so there are ways of connecting with people beyond the traditional channels, and I think we have to try and build that as much as we can. that deliberative process of change, I think, is important. But you have to also come back and recognise that one of the huge obstacles to this are these massive forces, these corporations who control what we say and how we say it. One of the great things about that leadership coup is we finally saw people starting to stand up, including the Prime Minister of the country, by the way, and say the media is part of the problem. We've got people in the media who are not being journalists, they're actively behaving like politicians. They're extensions of the political process. I mean, this was a Liberal politician. I mean, obviously a bit of self-interest going on, but Chris Ullman stood up and called it, Channel 9, you know, he named it. We've got to take on those big corporate vested interests, whether they're in our media, whether they're dictating energy policy or tax policy. Because, again, I come back to this, I think there are some people who'll never want to see society change, and, you know, one nation sort of prey on that. They hark back to this future that never, this past that never really existed. You know, this sort of mythical past when everything was okay. And there are a small group of people in our community, I think, who are attracted to that, but mostly people are up for the conversation. And the challenge for us is, how do we create the space for that conversation that's not mediated through people who've got an interest in where that conversation goes?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think marriage equality is a tough one, I think, for the LGBTQI community, of which I'm a proud member. I think the plebiscite was so upsetting, so profoundly upsetting for people, that I think the victory, as it was, even though, you know, a lot of people saw the numbers and felt that it was too close, you know. And I think just because it was so tiring, the night of the victory was not really one of celebration for a lot of people that I knew. It wasn't one of celebration for myself. Although the next morning I did wake up with a lighter feeling that it had passed. But I also just think, not to be non-optimistic about the plebiscite and the result of it, I just wanted to make a note that I think it shouldn't let us be complacent around those issues of gender and sexual diversity, just in terms of the fact that I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that's done, box ticked, we don't need to worry about the queer community anymore. But trans people are not in a great position, you know, and the other letters in that are not so well looked after and are not so recognised and are not enjoying the same kind of mainstream okayness. So I think things like safe schools are really important. The Australian, of course, ran a vicious campaign against safe schools. It's worthy to read that quarterly essay that Benjamin Law wrote about just exposing how that actually all worked. But I do think it's important for us to keep remembering to support our young people who are going through these things and not just think box ticked, moving on to another issue, because it is still an issue.
Thanks, Holly.
Yeah.
It's a really great and powerful reminder, and there's so many of you who've got so many excellent questions, and you're not going to be able to get to them now, I'm sorry. We might have a chance a bit later on, but thanks everyone who's been chiming in with questions online and in the audience. But I'm going to ask the panellists to now take their seats after one more round of applause for everything that you've heard tonight. It's wonderful answers from wonderful panellists. And there's one in particular who's spoken and graced us with her wit and her mind, and who now is also going to grace us with song. Hands together, please. Okay. Yeah. Well, Holly Throsby.
Thank you. When I was trying to work out what song to play tonight, this one seemed to be very fitting. It's about tending to one's immediate natural environment in a thoughtful and loving way. And it's set in spring, which we're now in, with some bushfires burning in the background, so it seemed to be on point.
feeling. I love the feeling. Doing some gardening in spring as the wind blows in. It brings a smell of smoke from the mountains west of here. As far as feelings go, I feel all the way from here. Of all the seeds we sow, some go dark and some go clear. And here I go, I'll plant some right here to make the earth sing. I love the feeling. I love the feeling. Ooh, I love the feeling. I love the feeling. Thank you.
Thanks. Holly, another round of applause. Wasn't that just amazing? I think
Well, the water's still
you'd agree with me that we've been pretty truly blessed by
the water's on these
and I'd like to thank you all for coming out and sharing this evening with us. I know it's cheap night at the Nova and the Kino, so you could have been out doing that, and instead you're here with us, which for a Melbourne audience shows real commitment. So thank you, everyone. And could I ask you please to join me in once more thanking Tim, Emily, Holly and Julian and Richard for their amazing, amazing speeches tonight. And I think Richard has some thank you presentations for our speakers as well. Some thanks. Let's do it officially.
Give our guests again, just come up here. We're really grateful. It's a big thing for people to come up, obviously at a political forum like this, and to come and participate and just be part of it. So I want to thank all of you for everything that you did tonight. It's really, we're most grateful. Thank you. Thank you. There you go. Thank you. Good on you. Thank you. Great. All right. You can cut now. Thanks.
Now, it wouldn't be a Greens event without an ask for money. So, if you liked what you've seen tonight and the message that we're getting out, we want to make sure it gets out broader than this room and broader than the people who've watched online. And as the questions that have come through tonight have shown, that one of the big challenges that we face is not what we stand for, but it's about getting people to hear what we stand for. And we feel pretty confident that once people hear it, they'll like it, but we just need help with doing that. And we got a call on the way here to say that Rio Tinto's donation isn't coming through this year. So we're going to be reliant on you. But the good thing is that with you and with your help, we're going to be able to do it. We're going to be able to get money through and get the message that we've been putting out here tonight out into the lounge rooms of millions and millions of people if you can help us. So I think we're going to see a little bit more of our message, and we're going to ask you to think about how you can donate. You'll be shown how you can donate. A message will go up there. If you're old-fashioned, there's buckets at the door so you can't escape by saying, oh, there they are, they're right at the back. We know how to get money out of you before you leave. So please take tonight, and if you believe in the things that have been said, then help us get that message out, because one thing that to let you in on a little trade secret, one thing politicians understand is when votes change. And when votes change, and especially when seats change, they start to pay attention. But we're going to need your help to make that happen. So I think we're going to have another short little video, and then we'll wind up for the evening.
Together, we can ensure everyone has what they need to live a good life.
Together, we can ensure no one is left behind.
Together we can create a sustainable future for our children.
A future where we put people before profit.
A future where we choose hope over fear.
A future where our environment is protected, not exploited.
We have a choice. It's a choice between the politics of yesterday
and a future for all of us.
Well, if you like that vision and you want everyone in the country to be seeing that on their mobile phones this evening, please help us out, donate, give us a bit of money, and if you need a bit of encouragement, come and join us for a few drinks now at the Acme Cafe and Bar afterwards. Thank you all so much for coming out, and let's go out and make sure that we have a future for all of us. Thank you.